Right. Hey guys, welcome to lesson 3 of the torso module. So this is the final lesson of the torso module, and for both module 2, 3, and 4, what we'll always be doing is looking at the simplification of what we've just studied, right? So we've studied the muscles of the torso, in this case. When you do it for the legs, when you do it for the arms, same thing. And what we'll now do is we'll see how we can use that muscle information, simplify it, and then what the resulting mannequin actually looks like. Because this, honestly, guys, is what you use most of the time. You're not going to concern yourself that much with what the muscle accurately represents most of the time, right? I'm not talking every time, but most of the time when you're sketching, ideating, making things up from imagination, you are relying on these abstractions. You are relying on these simplifications, on these manipulated forms. When you do things and you want to stretch proportions, you want to come up with creatures from imagination, you want to exaggerate things, right? And we'll look at some examples of that. You want to rely on a more simplified version because it's just easier to remember. And so when we look at this, when we look at the front version of the torso, what we're basically doing is we're combining a couple of things. And what we are combining is we're combining the muscles that will definitely contribute in changing the silhouette of the body. And so in this case, for the front side of the torso, and particularly the rib cage, it would be the pecs and the traps, right? Those are the ones from the front, at least. On the back, it would be the lats as well, that will change the silhouette of our torso. So as you can see here, illustrated is it's the pecs, that simplification on the pecs that we slap on top of that cylinder that represents the shoulder girdle, right? We have the egg for the rib cage, and then we have a simplified version for the neck and the traps. And then when we combine these in step 2, right? So this is a combination of this, and then this is a combination of this. And then what we're also doing is, of course, we're trying to more accurately represent the rib cage. So instead of it just being an egg, we are subtracting that shape from the egg and also flattening out the top. And it's sort of these combined forms that we then stack on top of each other to form a more realistic looking mannequin instead of what we used to use, which is just a simplified box, right? Or just a simple cylinder. And so I really like this approach because it's easier to understand and it's definitely a lot easier to manipulate in space. If we then move on to the obliques, we do the exact same exercise, right? So what we're doing is we're taking the most simple way to represent the abdomen region, which is just a squishy cylinder, and we're slapping that S-curvy shape of the obliques that I was talking about in the anatomy lessons. We're slapping that on top of it to come up with a form that looks a little bit more organic. And so because we're also incorporating this into more of a cylindrical shape, the resulting shape will look a little bit different, but that's kind of how we want you to think about it. If you want to think more about it as two bean shapes that wrap around that cylinder like this, right, then insert themselves into that cylinder like that. That's completely fine as well. Whatever you feel most comfortable with. So that's kind of what we want to instill with you, and what we want to make you aware of is that you can simplify these forms like what we saw in the anatomy videos and then combine them together to make something that looks more believable for the resulting human form. Same thing when we go to the pelvis. Like what I said with you in the anatomy lesson, like you can sort of regard the pelvis as a bucket, either it being a half a sphere with a flattened bottom like this. It can also just be a very straight tapering cylinder that represents a bucket, like what we have here. And then what we're doing is to easy or better indicate the shape of a pelvis is almost go towards the underwear principle, right? Where we cut out from the sides cylindrical shapes, and that kind of forms this underwear shape. Now, the reason we're doing that is because when we go towards our mannequinization of the legs, we want to create a shape that nicely wedges into this shape. So again, it's all about interlocking, right? And so that interlocking of shapes will give us a more believable result for a human form. It's still a human mannequin, right? We're not actually drawing accurately representing anatomy, but we're creating something that looks incredibly believable, especially when we start shading it and detailing it, right? So that's it for the pelvis. And then when we go and look at the torso from the back, we do the exact same principle, right? We take the egg shape, we take the shoulder girdle, we slap the lats from the back on top of them in combination with the traps, right? So this is kind of a combination between the lats and the traps, right? Kind of wet formed together. And then we have the neck, right? And this is the traps that will sit on top of it. And then when we have that resulting shape grouped together, we slap that on top of an egg that has that cutout, just like what we saw with the front. And that combination gives us a much more accurate representation of the back of the body. And then we can start combining these shapes together, interlocking them, both the torso, the abdomen region, and the pelvis region, to come up with something that looks a lot more interesting and a lot more believable. If we look at the full torso, that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're combining all of those simplified forms together to create something that is a lot more believable. Whether it be male or female, right? The only difference here will be proportion. Like what I discussed in lesson 1 of this course, right? When it comes to proportions, when we want to create more feminine looking shapes, right? This is in the general term, of course. We can have very feminine shapes, or we can have female bodies that look a lot more like male bodies than female bodies. But when it comes to the generic proportions, we can play with those, we can play around with those to create something like you can clearly see here that has that difference between, male and female. Now, interestingly enough, and this will be part of your assignment, by the way, is that what we can do now, because we have these forms, we understand these forms, is we can highly manipulate them. You can see this example here by Max Grecker, right? This is a torso that doesn't look anything like what we have here on the left, created by Lex. But the only thing Lex had to do was change the proportions of these simplified forms, but still keep all of the information and get the same result. And that's the fun and beauty about working with shapes like this. It becomes a lot easier to understand how to manipulate form, how to think about form, how to exaggerate it, how to cheat the rules, basically, because you're almost creating your own rules, right? You're based on what there is, based on the accurate information that is available, you create your own abstraction, your own simplification, and with that, you play around with it and have fun with it. And that's essentially when you can come up with some really cool, interesting designs, and also, again, your own unique style, because that's essentially what you want to go for, right? You want to have your own unique drawing style or painting style, whatever it is, but it starts with this. It starts with that simple construction, knowing how to simplify these forms and how to manipulate them in space and how to manipulate their contours, how to abstractify them. Everything we basically discuss in the beginner course, we're doing this on a more advanced level. That's what I wanted to discuss for this lesson. Make sure you watch the recap of it and then have fun with the assignment. Hey Artleys, welcome to lesson 3 of module 2. This lesson will be focusing on torso simplification. Now that we've gone through all the muscles of the torso, it's time to see how we can manipulate the main masses of the body to better represent the appearance of a torso. When we look at the two main masses that make up the torso, we can essentially draw them as two boxes. Although this is fine for spatial orientation, it will lack an organic human feeling. So to solve that problem, we should start implementing what we've learned about the bones and the muscles and see how we can come up with a better manipulated mannequin. As a quick disclaimer, we want to let you know that our interpretation does not have to be yours. We are simply giving you the tools to come up with your own solution, but feel free to use ours as well. Now, when we look at the torso from the front, we can identify a couple of muscles that will certainly dictate the form and silhouette of the anterior torso. This would be the trapezius, the pecs, the lats, and the obliques. Through studying the muscles individually, you should have better cultivated a sense of their form. When we combine them with the X shape of the rib cage, we can come up with a form that looks fairly anatomical. As for the abdomen region, instead of just using a cylinder, we can add the manipulated form of the obliques on top to come up with something a little more interesting. Lastly, the pelvis can be simplified into a bucket or can be further distilled into a solidified form that resembles, let's say, underwear. Together, these forms will form a better representation of the anterior torso than just two boxes. For the posterior or backside of the torso, we have a similar scenario. The pelvis and abdomen stay the same, yet the rib cage gets combined with the lats and the trapezius to form a shape that looks more like what you see here. When we look at a more feminine version of the simplified torso, we can see that the lats and traps are much less pronounced and the obliques will point outward more. The most important thing to keep in mind is that these forms should be considered flexible and bendable, as is our body. After all, you will often come across poses that show twists or bends in the torso, thus showing both anterior and posterior portions of the torso. A good understanding of the forms you establish will be necessary to draw these poses with simplified forms and ultimately from imagination, as this is the goal of this course. So when drawing the torso mannequin from imagination, it will serve you well to understand how these forms were built and welded together to form what we regard as a human torso. It will take quite some practice to become familiar and confident with these forms, but we are confident that these lessons and assignments will almost fast track that process for you. This means that your assignment for this lesson will be to redraw 10 torsos of the references you've used for the torso lessons. 5 poses that show the anterior side of the torso, and 5 of them that show more of the back or posterior side. Lastly, what you'll do is you'll stylize one of these torsos in the style of one of the artists that we share in the resources. As you can see here, we have an example by Max Grecke, and we have restylized our torso to fit his sort of stylization. Again, that's it, Artleets. We hope you have fun with these assignments, and we'll see you in the next one.